Therapy for the Dead. I know, it sounds like something out of a horror movie, maybe a seance, right? But it's actually one of the most profound and honestly challenging ideas in all of modern psychology. And it all came from the mind of Carl Jung. So let's really get into this, because what Jung was talking about wasn't a way to literally talk to ghosts. It was a way to understand and give a voice to the phantoms of our own family history. Not literal phantoms, but the unresolved psychological patterns that they left behind for us, for you and me to carry.
Now, take these words. I felt like the living dead. This is from a real, modern patient, a woman in her 60s who was just overwhelmed by this terror she couldn't even name. Her feeling, that feeling of being one of the living dead, that is the very condition Jung was trying to get to the bottom of. It's a state where the unfinished business of the past completely paralyzes the present, and that's exactly where our exploration is going to begin today.
So how in the world do we get from a century-old mystical vision to actual modern healing? Well, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to unpack what Jung really meant by therapy for the dead. Then we'll trace this whole idea back to its source, a really chaotic, intense period in Jung's own life. And finally, we'll see how these exact concepts are being used right now to help people who feel, well, haunted by their past.
All right, so let's tackle the big one right out of the gate. What did Jung mean by therapy for the dead? Let's be crystal clear about this. We are not talking about spiritualism. We're talking about a very radical form of depth psychology.
The absolute crucial point to get is this. The dead aren't spirits floating around us. No, they are the unanswered questions, the unlived lives, and the unresolved traumas of our parents and our grandparents and so on. See, these psychological patterns, they don't just vanish into thin air. They get passed down generation after generation. Jung had this powerful way of describing it, an impersonal karma within a family. It's this mind-bending idea that we don't just inherit genes, we inherit psychological debts.
Now, to understand where an idea this strange could even come from, we have to go back in time. We have to look at this period of intense crisis in Jung's life, a time when he literally had to turn away from the outside world to confront the absolute chaos that was erupting inside of him. This was the crucible where all began.
This whole period, which Jung himself called his confrontation with the unconscious, it was like this escalating descent into the unknown. It kicks off in 1913 with his secret journals, the Black Books, but by 1914 it morphs into this terrifying waking fantasy. And then, get this, by 1916, the chaos seems to break out of his mind and into his actual house, leading to this bizarre poltergeist-like event that demanded a response from him.
And this right here captures the fundamental split that Jung was feeling inside himself. He felt completely torn between what he called the spirit of the times, his public life as a respected scientist, the world of reason, and the spirit of the depths. This was the inner world of myth, of ancient symbols, and it was screaming for his attention. To heal himself, he knew he had to journey into those depths.
This whole confrontation really came to a head over 4 intense nights in January 1914. Jung was just overwhelmed by this vision of the dead, and they were lamenting that they had forgotten something important that should also have been lived. Now, in his fantasy, other people just see a man talking to himself, and they have him carted off to an asylum. But it's right there, in that moment of what looks like madness, that the huge insight strikes him. He realizes that the living have a duty, a responsibility, to address the unfinished business of the dead.
And this is the ethical principle that just emerges from that whole fantasy. For Jung, this was a complete game changer. Healing wasn't about trying to silence these inner voices anymore. It was about accepting this profound responsibility to actually listen to their lament and to engage with their pain as a pathway to his own wholeness.
But just listening, that wasn't going to be enough. By 1916, this passive encounter with the dead was about to become an active and, frankly, an urgent demand. The unresolved didn't just want to be heard anymore. They wanted to be taught. Jung described this ominous atmosphere just descending on his home. His kids started seeing figures. The doorbell would ring like crazy on its own. He said the air felt crammed full of spirits. This wasn't some simple haunting. It was a psychic pressure building up to an almost unbearable degree, and it was demanding to be expressed. And then the pressure just broke. The very same figures from his 1914 fantasy came back, but this time they had a clear demand.
They had gone seeking answers and had failed, so now they came to Jung for his consciousness. And his response? Over 3 nights, he basically channeled this text called the 7 Sermons to the Dead, giving voice to all their unanswered questions.
So you might be asking, where on earth were these figures coming from? Well, for Jung, the answer was the collective unconscious. Think of it this way. Underneath all your personal memories, there's this vast, shared reservoir of human experience. Archetypes, myths, instincts that we inherit from all of our ancestors. This, for Jung, was the mythic land of the dead, a psychic reality that every single one of us is born into.
And what was their demand? What did they want? According to Jung, the ultimate goal of any human life is what he called individuation. It's the lifelong journey to become your most complete, authentic self. And the dead, he realized, were the echoes of all those who failed to complete this journey. Their unlived potential doesn't just disappear. It remains as this kind of psychic energy in the collective, and it's always seeking a route to completion through those of us who are alive right now.
Okay, let's pause for a second. This is all fascinating as a piece of psychological history, for sure. But what does a mystical text channeled in 1916 have to do with modern therapy? I mean, how does any of this apply to someone like that patient we mentioned, the one who felt like she was one of the living dead?
This is where we pivot. Let's turn to the clinical work of an analyst named Ginny Hill, because she applied these exact concepts to a patient in crisis, and it really shows us how this therapy for the dead actually works in practice.
So the patient was a successful professional, but as retirement got closer, she was just plunged into this state of deep terror and insomnia. She felt disconnected, totally lifeless. And a key piece of her history? Her mother had died suddenly, decades earlier, and the patient admitted she never really grieved. She just sealed it up.
Now, the therapist didn't ask her to do exactly what Jung did, have a direct conversation with her mother's spirit. Instead, they used a really brilliant modern evolution of it, called a shared reverie. Together, the therapist and the patient began to imagine what the mother's inner world might have been like, her possible depression, her own feelings of isolation. They were exploring the feelings about the dead.
And the effect was just profound. By exploring her mother's potential inner life, the patient found that her own sealed-off history began to surface. In her own words, it was a bubbling up of memory that reconnected her with these buried parts of her own psyche.
And here is the real outcome. By engaging with her mother's unresolved pain, the patient was finally able to separate her own feelings from that inherited grief. She survived what she called her mortal fear, and came out the other side with a stronger, clear sense of her own self, no longer living in the shadow of that unresolved loss. So let's bring this all together now. This isn't just about one patient's story or one famous psychologist's strange visions. This is about a fundamental pattern of human psychology that affects all of us.
Jung's idea of an impersonal karma, what we might call that today, is intergenerational trauma. The anxieties, the depressions, the unresolved conflicts of one generation, they don't just disappear. They are so often unconsciously passed on to the next, shaping our lives in ways we might not even begin to realize.
So, the crucial takeaway is this. Paying attention to the lament of the dead is not some morbid obsession with the past. It's a vital act of psychological liberation. By compassionately imagining the inner worlds of those who came before us, we can start to identify the inherited patterns that we're carrying. And in doing that, we finally clear the space to live our own lives, not the unlived lives of our ancestors.
And that leaves us with one final, really vital question to think about. Consider the patterns in your own life, maybe the persistent anxieties or sorrows you feel. It's worth asking yourself, are all of them truly yours, or could some of them be the unanswered questions of the past, just waiting for a new kind of answer from you?